And now back to Just Energy Radio with Dr. Rita Louise.
Hello and welcome back to the show. I'm your host, Dr. Rita Louise, and we're here speaking with Robert Schoch about, well, Egypt. Now we're going to talk about the Hall of Records underneath the foot of the Sphinx, and get all the juice about that. His website is robertschoch.com. Welcome back, Robert. Thank you so much for being on for 2 hours with us. I just really appreciate it. And I'm like, okay, I got through one bullet point on my paper. We're moving on to number 2. Okay, so from what I understand, and you might know a little bit more detail, that Edgar Cayce, as part of his work, identified that there was a Hall of Records that held the basis of knowledge in the history of mankind in a chamber that was located under the paw of the Sphinx. And I know you've done some work on seeing if it was actually there and trying to locate it, and I'm going to make the assumption that you think there might be something there.
Well, let me, with all due respect, let me correct you a little bit.
No, go ahead.
I haven't done any work to locate it, but I gotta say this. When we did, Thomas DeBecke and I is the we here, and John Anthony West, we did, and I wanted to do some subsurface studies around the Sphinx to tie in with what I was seeing on the surface, erosional features, that type of thing. So I very much wanted to see subsurface profiles around the base of the Sphinx. So we did seismic work, and this was in the early 1990s, because my personal primary goal was to look at subsurface weathering. How far down, how deep was the weathering going? Because this is a way to independently calibrate and get a sense to date the Sphinx. So that's where I was coming from. When we did that, you can also pick up other things. For instance, you can pick up extremely hard, dense layers of limestone in this case. You can pick up cavities in the limestone. And what we found was, to summarize, a cavity under the left paw of the Sphinx, a very regular rectangular cavity. What that means to us geologically and geophysically is it's probably not natural. It's probably an artificial chamber under the left paw of the Sphinx. So we found this. I talked about this. We also found a cavity in the rear of the Sphinx and what looks like probably a broken tunnel-like feature along the length of the Sphinx, more or less, sort of from the left paw, I'm doing this off of memory, to the right rump, going back. So we found these features. I discussed them. I published them. I had known who Edgar Cayce was. In fact, from a late uncle, I remember as even a teenager discussing Edgar Cayce. I was actually, and I admit I was just not that much into Edgar Cayce. I was not that knowledgeable about Edgar Cayce. I did not know he had talked about a Hall of Records in or near or around the Sphinx. So we found this chamber under the left paw. I publicized it. I discussed it. Lo and behold, I literally got a phone call, and I remember it to this day. I got it in my office at Boston University, which was actually a different office than the one I'm seeing now. But I got the phone call. It was from a very nice fellow at the ARE, Association for Research and Enlightenment, the Edgar Cayce Foundation, and he informed me that Edgar Cayce had predicted a Hall of Records, a chamber, essentially in the vicinity of the Sphinx where we had found it. So it's not that I went looking for it. In fact, we found it, and then I learned about Cayce's prediction long ago that it should be there, which I think is actually even stronger corroboration for those that want to make it that for Cayce's prediction. to my knowledge, and there's been all kinds of things on the internet about being entered, maybe surreptitiously, that type of thing. To my knowledge, it has not been entered. It is I believe, to the best of my knowledge, it is a chamber, probably a man-made or artificial chamber. By what you could call the ringing or resonance of it, it seems to have something in it, so it's not totally empty. When I say something in it, it is possible from a geologic point of view that was just an empty chamber and the ceiling collapsed, so now it's got something in it. It could also be full of gold and scrolls and who knows, records, who knows what. One problem with it, just to finish the thought, is that the water table in Egypt on the Giza Plateau, or where actually in front of the Sphinx at the moment, is rising, and it may be flooded at the moment. It probably is flooded because of the rising water table, which is a shame. But it's definitely there.
I'm really glad you shared that story, about it being, your findings being corroborated or vice versa.
Yeah,
what
exactly.
I think is really interesting, however.
Yeah, because we didn't go looking for what Edgar Cayce had predicted. I didn't even know he had said that until after we found it. I was quite shocked. No pun intended on my name.
What I find interesting, though, is that, they had that mini-series with our good friend Dr. Zahi Hawass, where he was calling everybody pyramidids and saying, there's no chamber down here. They did this seismic stuff, and they drilled holes. But listening to what you're saying doesn't corroborate what he was saying.
No. It's interesting. Now, I wouldn't want to go against my good friend Zahi Hawass, but we can have different views on things. He is still Minister of Antiquities or whatever he is now. He got sort of thrown out for a month or something, or resigned, and then got reinstated. Well, he's back, but then I don't know, he's had court cases against him, but we won't go there. I don't know the details. But interestingly, what's interesting to me is he is actually pumping at the moment. He's put down boreholes and last I was there, he was pumping the groundwater out of the area to try to, make sure things, do what he can to try to stabilize things. Now, I'm not sure why you need to do that if there's no chamber down there, but that's another matter. So, maybe he's just hedging his bets.
Okay, so
but
I don't know. I just think that there's
Dahi's been known to say things don't exist other times when they do, and he's been known to say things do exist when they don't. So, everyone makes mistakes.
Well, it just seems that there's a certain air of secrecy about some things that they either have found or haven't found or want to disclose that's coming out of Egypt.
Absolutely. No, there's no question. And that it does make it frustrating because you just don't know in some cases what has been done, we'll say surreptitiously or off the record, and what has been done. And, I hear continued rumors that he's gone into the chamber, that type of thing. Now, how he would do that exactly surreptitiously, I don't know. And then another question that comes up quite a bit, and I might as well answer it now before you even ask it, is how does one enter that chamber? If I'm right that there's a chamber there, where's the entrance? It seems to be solid bedrock around the Sphinx and above the Sphinx, so, how did they get in there? And what we found seismically is, and I'll just try to picture it for people, the Sphinx sits on the eastern edge of the Giza Plateau. It faces east. The Sphinx faces due east. In front of the Sphinx, so just east of the Sphinx, is the Sphinx Temple. It sits right at the paws of the Sphinx. It's this massive stone temple, very ruinous now. Then beyond the Sphinx Temple, you keep going east, until recently, it was just basically sand, a level sand, a plain of sand. we did seismic lines in that sand just to see what was under the sand. What we found is that it's not just flat sand with bedrock just underneath. It's actually a cliff. There's actually a cliff, if you would, a bedrock cliff under the sand. So if you remove all that sand, what you would find is there's a bedrock cliff, and essentially the Sphinx temple and the Sphinx sit on what was originally a bedrock cliff. That, it's all been filled in with sand now. So I suspect, this has been my suspicion, and it's only a hypothesis, that the way to get into the chamber under the pod of the Sphinx is there may be a tunnel going into the face of that bedrock cliff, which is now covered with sand. Does that make sense?
Let me just ask a question. So the Sphinx and that area is actually kind of elevated from the surrounding bedrock.
That's right, if you removed all the sand to the east of it, which is a lot of sand. It's probably built up it's definitely built up over thousands and thousands of years. But I suspect in the face of that cliff under the sand, there's probably an entrance, a tunnel that goes under the Sphinx temple and into that chamber or cavity beneath the left paw of the Sphinx. Now, it may be a very small entrance, it may be concealed, that type of thing, but I suspect that's where the entrance is, which is fairly inaccessible at the moment.
But there are people that say that the whole pyramid complex was actually surrounded by water.
Oh, yeah, some people say that. I'm not convinced the whole pyramid complex was, but certainly to the east, the Nile rivers, to this day to the east, and it has varied, geologically and historically, prehistorically, where it was, how close it was to the plateau, how far away it was. Certainly it sometimes came up and basically lapped up to the edges of the plateau, that type of thing. In some cases, with very high waters, it even lapped up and, came up to around the Sphinx temple. But that's a different. That's an issue, and I've certainly been looking at that and taking into account. I just want to point out that is not the cause of the erosion that I'm seeing around the Sphinx, which is actually coming from above, and the heaviest erosion on the Sphinx itself and the walls of the Sphinx enclosure are the highest level, so they're not undercutting. They're not coming. It's not from Nile waters coming from below and working their way up. It's a complex situation. There's different things happening there.
Well, it might be complex, but it just seems so simple. Your observation
was
just so simple.
The overall view, once you've got it, is quite simple. I'm just saying from a geologic point of view, there's lots of little things happening. Yeah, a lot of little things happening. But no, the overall picture should be fairly simple, and I hope will become fairly simple in people's minds, except Egyptologists.
Right.
They tend to make things more complicated when it suits their purposes. I hope that's not nasty.
No, we like that kind of conversation on this show. I know this isn't your area of expertise, but I'm just going to throw this out there at you.
Okay.
In areas such as in Tiwanaku, they say that Viracocha created Tiwanaku overnight, or in Uxmal, Mexico, the Pyramid of the Magician was built overnight.
Right.
When we're talking about the Sphinx, are there any kind of legends or stories that support it or its building that you've ever heard?
No, actually not. Because the earliest that you really get, okay, let me back up. There are always legends and stories, but some of those, I hate to put it crudely, sometimes you hear legends and stories that go back 50 years. Okay, so I'm just excluding anything like that, the bogus ones, in my opinion, the bogus ones. So as far as really ancient legends and stories, what we have is dating essentially from the Old Kingdom period, and then translations, transliterations are passing down just like biblical texts, going back 500, 600 BC or earlier. We don't have, in the vast majority of cases, even a scrap that actually goes back that far. So you have, copies of copies of copies of copies. But let's just assume the copies are relatively correct. You can date some of them back to Old Kingdom times, and those, depending on the ones you want to believe, actually talk about the Sphinx having already been in existence. So, for instance, Khufu having built things around the Sphinx, Khufu having having reverence for the Sphinx, the lightning hitting the Sphinx, and at that time, et cetera, et cetera. But it's sort of at least my knowledge and interpretation of them assumes it's there already. It doesn't actually talk about the building of it. It sort of takes it as a given that it is there, if that makes sense.
No, fair answer.
Yeah.
Before we move from Egypt, one last little question. With the new government now in Egypt, do you think they're going to be more open to looking at history from a different perspective, or coughing up the goods that might be in somewhere?
This is honestly something I'm hoping to find out this summer, for various reasons, not just the government turmoil over there. I was hoping to be there in March, then I was hoping to be there this month, and I was hoping to be there in May, which doesn't look like it's going to happen, but maybe in June I will be able to get over there finally. And I'd like to get a sense of things. I mean, it depends. It depends on a lot of factors. One, it depends on Zahi Hawass and exactly what his role is going to continue to be. Because, you could say the new government, but if Zahi Hawass is still Minister of Antiquities or whatever his title is at the moment, he was promoted just before the Mubarak government fell, and they seem to have that back. From a Egyptian antiquities point of view, if he's in charge, he is the government, if that makes sense. Now, whether he will take a different approach and a different tact, since he's been personally attacked because it has undergone this, that's very hard to say. So there's a Zahi Hawass factor, and I want to be very clear. I have nothing personally against Zahi Hawass. We can disagree and we can agree on things, and I've had many delightful moments with him. People can think what they want of him, but they can think what they want of me too. He's a major factor. The second major factor I would say is money, and Egypt is, I won't say totally dependent on tourism. Certainly that's not the case, but tourism has been a big chunk of its economy in recent decades, even recent centuries. And right now, you have a revolution, that type of thing. I've known more than a few people that were planning to go to Egypt, and the revolution happened, the regime change happened, and things seem unsettled. Now they're not going to Egypt, and they're waiting. They're not sure when, if at all, they'll go to Egypt. So that has a real effect on the economy of Egypt. Will they want to do things to encourage people to come back in terms of tourism? Will they even want to maybe be a little more open and flexible about their own thinking about their antiquities? If it means more tourism, I don't know. I mean, that's not a good reason to change your mind on something, but it may be the reality. But it's really speculation at this point. We have to see how things happen. I think the biggest issue really is Dr. Hawass and what his role is going to be in the coming months and years.
Yeah. Okay. I'm just going to. I have some smart comments, but I think I'm just going to leave them.
What about? about Hawass or about?
Well, if he ends up in jail for a year, like they're talking about on the internet, then
I know. They're talking about that. I mean, he was but Egypt's Egypt, and he's a tough guy too.
For a long time I didn't care for him, but then they did that miniseries, and he became very endearing to me. I really kind of like him.
I have to ask. I mean, so don't take it the wrong way. Have you met him in person?
No.
Okay,
there's just what you see on TV.
Yeah, he's very. He can be totally one way sometimes. He has to put on the facade. I mean, I shouldn't even say facade, but he is a high government official. He's much higher than people realize sometimes in the U.S. He is at the highest levels in his role. Sometimes maybe an analogy would be a cabinet level person, or he's a minister now. I mean, he's very, very high. And when you're in a position like that, I'm not trying to make excuses for him, but you have to do tough things, and sometimes you have to take a tough stance, and you have to toe the party line, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, I've also had personal private dinners with him sometimes over the year, not for business at all, just with him and a good friend of his that I know, that type of thing. He can be a wonderfully endearing, even sweet person. He's very interesting, articulate person. So I mean, there are many sides of him. And I think within, many people like that. But he's a very interesting, complex person, put it that way. And I say that, with all due respect. He's a really fascinating person.
Well, and he is the face of Egypt.
He is the face of Egypt, and you said it, and I would agree. From even personal experience, he can be incredibly endearing. He can be incredibly good. I've been there sometimes with students, and he can be so sweet with the students. And, I remember once being there with some students and just ran into him by chance. And the next thing you know, he's scribbling in Arabic on a scrap of paper and says, go back when you get back to Giza, because we were down in Middle Egypt. When you get back to Cairo, go to Giza and give this to so-and-so, one of the inspectors that I knew. And I didn't even know what it said in Arabic. And next thing we go back and we do that. And next thing you know, he's showing us some, absolutely, never seen before. And they told us, don't take any pictures, because, they hadn't had chance to even look at it, but new excavations where they'd found some skeletons material. And I mean, the students loved it. It was, he can be a wonderful person. And very, so, I mean, there are many sides of any complex person like that. So he's not all. Sometimes people want to paint him as this evil, whatever. But on the other hand, to be in Egypt and to survive that long, you can't be a wimp.
That's right.
And you can't help but it's the old truism: you can't please everyone all the time, and and you're going to make enemies. So it's none of these things are there's always subtleties to it.
Right. Okay, well, we're going to leave Egypt and start talking about what I think is one of the most exciting things to come out in the last hundreds of years in archaeology, and that's Gobekli Tepe.
Yeah,
and I'm just going to give that to you to introduce that to the listeners if they're not familiar with that site.
Yeah, Gobekli Tepe is an absolutely amazing site. It's in southeastern Turkey. It's not that far from the Syrian border, which is sort of a problem now with the unrest in Syria. But it's an absolutely incredible site. I had the honor and pleasure of going there last May. I'm trying to get back there as we speak. The problem is, at the moment, people aren't being allowed there, and they're not excavating, I think primarily because of the unrest in Syria, and they're worried about, the Turkish government is worried about what's happening on the Syrian border and refugees coming across. That's my speculation, but there's clearly issues there. So that's a modern political situation. But Gobekli Tepe is this incredible site. It was found in the mid-1990s. It's being excavated currently by Professor Dr. Klaus Schmidt of the German Archaeological Institute, a wonderful person, very straightforward, we'll call it conventionally trained archaeologist. That's important because even he dates it to an incredibly early period, about 8 to 10,000 BC. So right at the end of the last ice age that I was talking about before. It consists of essentially stone circles. People can think of Stonehenge, but it's not like Stonehenge in the sense that it's not just one or two stone circles, but probably maybe 22 or so stone circles that have been found by remote means, geophysical means. He has excavated the better part of 4 of them so far as of the latest excavations. These are circles, sort of, again, picture Stonehenge, but much more sophisticated. And Stonehenge is thousands of years later. Stonehenge is, about crudely 5,000 years ago. This is 10 to 12,000 years ago, so twice as old plus. And they're huge monoliths arranged in basically circles, and in each case with a pair of monoliths in the middle of the circle. These are not just crude Stonehenge-type blocks, but they're beautifully surfaced, beautifully carved, with beautiful sharp edges, beautiful surfaces, and in high relief they're carved with various animals, that type of thing. The central stones, at least for one circle, have arms on them, so they're anthropomorphic. They have a belt, arms and a belt. They seem to be aligned, this is my analysis now, they seem to be aligned, I believe, to the a region of the sky that includes Orion and Taurus and the Pleiades. These are constellations that we know go back tens of thousands of years. They seem to be aligned to that in the vernal equinox. If you do the archaeoastronomy, it's just an absolutely incredible site. And if you were approaching this site for the first time as a standard conventional archaeologist and you saw these structures and the level of sophistication, the level of carving, you would probably say, oh, they're 1500 BC or something like that. You wouldn't say they're 10,000 to 9,000 BC, which is what they date to. And interestingly, the entire site was purposefully buried. It was not simply abandoned and left to be covered by dust and sand and the elements. It was purposefully buried. Essentially, as Professor Schmidt said to me, an artificial mountain was erected over it by 8000 BC, by 10,000 years ago. They were purposefully burying it, purposefully covering it over. Which, frankly, in some ways, it's a different type of activity and labor, but probably took virtually as much labor as to carve them and erect them in the first place. Other things, I'm summarizing briefly, other things about the site, it's very clear, it was used over a period of time. Break time,
but we're going to come back to this topic because it's just fascinating. I'm Dr. Rita Louise. We're talking to Dr. Robert Schoch. Right now we're talking about Gobekli Tepe, and we'll be back after these words from our sponsors.
Just Energy Radio with your host, Dr. Rita Louise, will return right after these messages. Back to Just Energy Radio with Dr. Rita Louise.
and welcome back to the show. I'm Dr. Rita Louise, and we're here talking with Dr. Robert Schoch. His webpage is robertschoch.com. Robert, before the break, we just barely started talking about the site at Gobekli Tepe, and you were talking about the carving and the monolithic structures that are there. For the listeners, I have a bunch of questions. For the listeners, how big are those the monoliths? You know, how big are they? About how much do they weigh? That kind of thing.
They're very interesting. They're limestone. They're very thin. They're typically several meters tall. I think 9, 10 feet tall or more. And they probably weigh most of them. They're not huge by my standards, dealing with Egypt and that type of thing in terms of weight. They're probably 10 to 15 tons, best estimate. But they're actually very tall and thin, which is a really interesting issue of how they got them to stand up. Right now, as they're excavating, they actually brace them with wood and wires. When they were originally done, they may have had some kind of superstructure bracing them around, or they may have just been set so perfectly in the bedrock that they wouldn't fall over. It's actually a somewhat interesting problem that makes it potentially even more sophisticated. But I mean, they're certainly big enough. I mean, for no one until it was uncovered and excavated really would have even believed that people were carving such sophisticated, beautifully carved monoliths in the 10-plus ton range over 10,000 years ago. And I wanted to make the very quick point that when I first came out with my redating of the Sphinx, pushing it back, 5,000 initially, I was being very conservative, saying 5,000 BC and earlier. I mean, the Egyptologists were just all over me. They were literally coming up and spitting in my face, saying, that's impossible. That's impossible. You're just a charlatan trying to get media attention, get your name on, get your face on TV or something, which was which was not the truth at all. Frankly, I did not want attention. I didn't want that. And one of the big criticisms lodged against me was, if they were so sophisticated in Egypt, if they were building the Sphinx and the Sphinx Temple and doing this stuff, prior to 5,000 BC, why is it only in this one spot? Why don't we have evidence of such a high level of sophistication of megalithic building, et cetera, at an early period elsewhere in the Middle East, even elsewhere anywhere in the world? And at that time, Gobekli Tepe had not even been discovered. If I'd had Gobekli Tepe at that time, I would have said, well, look in Turkey. You get exactly the same thing, but it hadn't even been discovered yet at that time. So now we have, and that's what part of the importance for me personally is this vindication that, look, we have just as sophisticated technology, stoneworking, what we can call real civilization. And this is coming from the German Archaeological Institute, and they're sponsoring. Professor Schmidt is classically trained. I talked to him at length about the dating techniques, which is based on geology and microstalactites. We can go into that if you really want to, and the dating of them by standard radiocarbon dating, by looking at the stratigraphy, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, the dating is absolutely firm and absolutely confirms what I've been saying all along for sophisticated levels of culture and civilization going back, to that remote period. So for me, it's very important. It's confirmation of what I've been saying.
The part that I find the most interesting is that, and I'm just going to say, according to historians, we didn't even have agriculture 9,000
No.
BC.
In fact, they insist
we didn't
to
have
this
domesticated animals 9,000
Exactly. No, this is by the standard chronologies, and I'm not even expressing opinion one way or another on it, but by the standard chronology, by the conventional thinking, Gobekli Tepe and the earliest portions of the Sphinx and what's happening there, it's pre-agricultural, pre-domestication, or at least pre-most domestication. I mean, some will argue they had domesticated dogs and whatnot by then. But it's certainly pre-agricultural revolution. If people want to use that term, it's sort of an old-fashioned term. But, yeah, it's very early. You're really pushing back into the end of the last ice age when people were supposed to be, by conventional thinking, really primitive, grubbing, sort of grunting, hunter-gatherer, caveman type, the end of the sort of the cavemen. Really, pretty grim and brutish, not sophisticated, carving things like proto-sphinx or the incredible astronomically aligned, beautifully carved structures at Gobekli Tepe. So it really means a revolution in our thinking and what's going on. The other thing I was starting to say before the break, just to finish a thought, was that Gobekli Tepe was covered over, and I am convinced of that now looking at the evidence firsthand. It was covered over purposefully by about 8,000 BC, 10,000 years ago. Real question as to why. I think it had to do with catastrophes that were occurring on Earth at the time. But it was covered over by 8,000 BC, and I'm convinced, looking at the site and the structures that have been excavated so far, that it was used and reused for probably, in crude terms, at least a couple of thousand years. When you look at some of the stone circles there, some of the monoliths, you can see that even in ancient times, they had fallen down, they were re-erected, they were raised up again, so they were used, they were reused. There's walls that were added later to the original structure. And again, everything I'm talking about is then covered over by 8,000 BC. So all this use and reuse is pre-8,000 BC, pre-10,000 years ago. And again, by conventional standards, being that far back, it is just incredible. And that's the latest phase of use.
Okay, you said something that was a little dichotomous. You said that it was intentionally covered over, and then you said catastrophe.
Yeah. Okay. I think
they don't correlate to me.
Well, okay. Let me explain. That's good that you brought that up then, because they make perfect sense to me. In the sense that I believe, and this is something I'm developing right now, my own, I don't want to call it pet theory, but maybe it is, that there were major things happening at the end of the last ice age. We go from a cold spell, the ice age, into a warming period based on ice cores that happens very, very quickly. I mean, this is data just within the last couple of years based on Greenland ice cores. We may go from the ice age to essentially very quickly into modern temperatures or close to modern temperatures within just a couple of years, within 3 years, about 9700 BC. It's a real question to this day as to why we get into that warm spell, why there's this warm snap so quickly. I think personally it has to do, and I mentioned this briefly on my website, with solar outbursts, with solar activity, with what sometimes people refer to as coronal mass ejections, basically solar outbursts, essentially charged particles, what's known as plasma in physics, hitting the Earth, hitting the atmosphere, warming, essentially huge thunderbolt-type phenomena would have occurred. It could have drastically changed temperatures. It would have also made things very uncomfortable on the surface of Earth, literally in some cases potentially incinerating, causing fires, changing climates. I think that, and this is just a working hypothesis, that there may have been things like that happening in the area of Gobekli Tepe, that the people were trying to survive it. They may have decided that they just couldn't take it anymore. They had to migrate somewhere else. And one hypothesis I have is that before doing that, instead of simply abandoning their site because it was important, maybe they thought they were coming back to it, who knows what, they carefully buried it, which has, if they hadn't done that, it wouldn't have been preserved the way it is. It's beautifully preserved. It just needs to be excavated, which is a very slow, tedious process. But they seem to have, they clearly buried it purposefully. I think that it may have been because of external factors that made the area uninhabitable, that they felt they had to leave or, whatnot. Does that make some sense?
Mm-hmm.
I'm not saying you have to agree with it, but that's where I'm coming from.
Mm-hmm. No, it does make sense. You mentioned, you've kind of correlated these monoliths to Stonehenge, and just in a very generic way.
Yeah, not correlated. I just use that as an analogy, because Stonehenge is thousands of years later. And I'm just
going to stay with that analogy. But then you said that they've excavated like 4 areas. Did each of these areas have circles? And then part B, if they've excavated 4, how much more is there to the site?
It's a huge area. Okay, they have excavated portions of 4 circles. These are all part of one big excavation. The circles are very close to each other. They're not on top of each other, but they're right next to each other. So these 4 stone circles, and they're large circles, but they're right next to each other in the very same vicinity. And geophysically, Professor Schmidt said they found, maybe 18 others so far just in that one area alone. So, there were a number. This was not just an isolated thing of building 1 or 2 stone circles. This was, even building 1 or 2 would be an incredible feat, but they were building numerous ones. So, we're talking really concerted effort. Again, this is even more indicative of a major culture, a major civilization. One reason I think that they were building them and rebuilding them and then building new ones is, I believe, and this is my analysis now, not anyone else, so other people can disagree with it, but I think that they were aligning them to objects in the sky, so they were astronomically aligned. And if people are familiar with precession, the stars shift, objects in the sky shift very slightly. It takes about 72 years to shift 1 degree, but they do shift slightly. If you're talking precise astronomical alignments, you have to realign things periodically. Otherwise, they end up being off by quite a bit. Precession gives rise to the age of Aquarius, the age of Aries, all that age of Pisces, all of that. That's precession. So they seem to have been, by my analysis, using these stone circles astronomically aligned over a long enough period that in some cases they got so far out of alignment, I think they built a second one and a third one. So again, it indicates continuity. It indicates that they're not all being built at the same time. They're all covered over by 8,000 BC, but some of them I think are, potentially thousands of years earlier than that. So, again, how far back the oldest ones go, we just don't know at this point.
And they haven't, done necessarily all the digging that there is.
That's right. The oldest one that has been, by my analysis, the 4 that have been excavated enough to see alignments, to see what's going on with them, I think personally date, and this is compatible with the independent dating techniques Professor Schmidt has used. I believe they date from about 10,000 BC to 8,000 BC, or about 10,000 to 8,500 BC, covered over about 8,000 BC. So somewhere in that range, but seem to span the very end of the last ice age to just after it. when, again, from a geologic point of view, I think these other catastrophes were taking place, natural catastrophes.
I'm going to ask kind of a weird question.
Sure.
Elevation-wise, is this site located like on a mountain, or is it more in a valley or a plain?
No, essentially it's on a mountain. Essentially it's a mountain. It's sort of a low-lying, it's not like the Andes or something like that, but it is high up. It is high up. It would have been, and I think that's important for two reasons. One, it would have been good for sighting to the stars, to the sky. And secondly, the type of thing I'm talking about as far as solar outbursts, phenomena coming from the skies, creating what I'll call loosely a catastrophe, bringing about the end of the last ice age, that would have also affected that area perhaps more readily than low-lying areas, which means it may have had to be abandoned. But yeah, they're essentially in mountains. I would call it a low mountainous site. And Professor Schmidt, points out when he talks about that it's in the mountains.
And so you talked about how you think it might have been used for viewing the stars.
Well, I don't know if I want to call it an observatory per se, but I think it certainly had astronomical, and frankly back then, what we would now call, and I don't use any negative sense, and probably most of your reviewers would not see this negative, astrological purposes, astrological significance, aligned to the cosmos, aligned to the constellations. Whether they were recognizing all the constellations that we recognize is another matter. There is a lot of evidence, and you're probably aware of this, that Taurus and Orion and the Pleiades have been recognized for at least 15,000, probably closer to 30-plus thousand years. I mean, that based on evidence we have. Could be a lot longer than that. And by my analysis, my personal analysis, I think these were aligning toward that region of the sky.
See, something that always bugs me about archaeology in the general sense of the word, and we joke around about this watching TV, is everything is for like some religious purpose. It's like, here's this McDonald's coffee cup, 2,000 years ago it was for some religious purpose. It's like, no, I had a code.
If you don't know the reason that they built something, or it's either a tomb or it's a temple, it's always religious. And this is a problem. This is a problem. But on the other hand, and this is not to defend conventional archaeologists, on the other hand, probably the concept of what we call religion and life otherwise was probably not as dichotomous and separated as it is for some people in the modern material world. But I find it very, very frustrating that everything is just assigned that purpose. But then they also, I'll use example of astrology. For the ancients, astrology was not necessarily religious, depending on how you view religion. That type of thing.
I mean, it was a science.
Yeah, absolutely. So these may have been, from our point of view, what we would call science. From their point of view, the equivalent more of science, that type of thing. Now, it's true so far, but only a very small portion has been excavated. It does not seem to be a habitation site in the sense that there's not evidence of people living there full time, I'm going to say having toilet facilities, but you see what I mean. It doesn't seem to be living quarters.
Isn't there another site near that, though, that was identified as...
that's what I was going to say. It may simply be that what's been excavated so far is it's a university of a much larger complex, if I could use that analogy. That's part of the problem, that such a small proportion has been excavated so far.
But isn't there another site? I want to say Çatalhöyük or something.
Oh, Çatalhöyük. Yeah.
I was close.
Yeah. That's a bit later in time, but that's definitely living quarters, a city, actually probably for the time, fairly large city, that type of thing. Yeah, so absolutely. I mean, clearly these people were living somewhere too, and they were going about their business that one has to do to stay alive. It just doesn't seem that right now the evidence of what's been excavated at Gobekli Tepe is not, should we say, stressing that. But it may just be a function of so little has been excavated proportionally.
Mhm.
Yeah.
I just find that site so fascinating.
With the religion stuff, I don't know where I heard this. I'm going to bastardize it horribly, but the classic thing of I think it was supposedly in the 19th century, and a couple of professors and their students, and they're in Greece, and they're studying both ancient Greece and modern Greece, and the peasants, in the 19th century, and there's these huge, you may have heard this story, there's these huge stone bowls outside of all the houses and some peasant village, and so they're all speculating about the function of them. They must have some ritualistic purposes and, sacred water or this and that and the other thing. And finally one of the undergraduates says, well, why don't we just ask someone? And they ask, and they're the dog bowls. The dogs have to drink water.
I have not heard that one.
Supposedly it's true.
God, that's bad. Let's see. We have about 3 more minutes.
And make everything religious.
Oh, it just makes me laugh. I'm going to be buried, and have my entrails put into like a McDonald's cup and a Wendy's cup.
Exactly.
Whataburger
the canopic
cup,
jars.
like my little canopic jars, and they'll be like,
that's right.
It's for ritualistic purposes.
Absolutely.
I don't know what they're going to think of us, thousands of years from now when they start digging up our stuff.
Oh, they dig up the iPods and the iPads and I guess CDs are going out the window now, and flash drives and whatnot. Can't you imagine all of those are going to be little icons and little amulets and whatnot? They'll have no clue what they really were.
Yeah, I just laugh. But I just always think about all those plastic products that are just not going to...
Oh, yeah, they're going to survive. They're going to survive 50,000 years or more.
There won't be any building. They'll just be plastic products with great logos.
Exactly. No, it's actually a really important topic. If you think about so many thousands of years from now, what will survive of our civilization and what won't survive, and if you knew nothing about it, which is essentially what we know, we know nothing about, say, the Gobekli Tepe people. I'll call them that because we don't have a good name for them otherwise. 10,000 plus years later, what little survives, everything that doesn't survive, you can't even imagine it, and how do you figure out what they were all about based on the little that survives, which is not necessarily representative of everything that they stood for and that they, that made up their culture and civilization.
I always am reminded of Planet of the Apes when Charlton Heston goes into that cave and there's the dentures and the eyeglasses and the doll. But then, of course, at the end, the Statue of Liberty all busted up, and it's
right. Yeah, exactly.
That's what they'll think of us.
Yeah, exactly.
Robert, our time's just about up. Any last words? Any speaking engagements or any new books or anything exciting coming up for you?
I'm always working on books, but we'll keep that. I'll let you know when something comes out. I'm going to be speaking in Poland. I don't know if anyone will make that next month. I'm hoping to do a lot of traveling this summer, depending on the political situation. I'll be speaking at CPAC, Conference on Precession and Ancient Knowledge, and I think it's late September. I have that on my website banner people can click on. It's a very, very interesting conference. It's being held in Sedona, Arizona. This time I've spoken at it before. I'll probably be speaking in Dubai again in November. Otherwise, I teach full-time at Boston University, so that limits my possibilities sometimes. And there's other things that are in the works, but the one, especially for Americans, Sedona CPAC, Conference on Precession and Ancient Knowledge, is a really fascinating conference. And I would encourage people to go to my website and click on the link for that if they think they might be interested.
And that would be robertschoch.com, and that's
Robert Schoch,
and
can I was going to say Robert SCHOCH, all one word, .com. Yeah.
Robert, thank you so much for coming on. The music's going to come up in a second. I didn't get to all my questions, so I'm going to have you back because you're very cool.
Okay, we will do that sometime.
Okay.
There's the music. Okay.
Yeah.
Well, it's been wonderful.
All right. Thank you. All right.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
That was Robert Schoch. Again, his webpage is www.robertschoch, that's SCHOCH.com. And next week, we're going to be talking about karma and reincarnation. Have you been here before? And to do that, we'll be speaking to Barbara Martin and Dimitri Morales. And so, till next time, I'm Dr. Rita Louise. This is Just Energy Radio. Be blessed.
Join host Dr. Rita Louise each week at this time for Just